cost of tuition and fees at for-profit institutions are unequivocally high across the board, less than 2-year, 2-year, and 4-year institutions when you compare them against nonprofits and against public institutions. In fact, if you look at, for example, the 2-year sector, 1 year worth of tuition and fees at a for-profit college in 2009-10 was on the order of $14,000, whereas in the public sector, at a 2-year institution, the average cost was less than $3,000, so a 5-time higher cost at the for-profits. And the value is low for students, or at least of questionable value. The fact is that a lot of that money that's put into tuition and fees does not make itself back to student support services or to instruction. If you compare, for example, for-profits with nonprofits, nonprofit institutions are less expensive, yet they spend about 3.5 times more on instruction per student than do the for-profits. So the cost that the students are paying is not being reverted back to them in terms of the instructional and support services that they need to be successful. So another question is then what are the students getting for what they're paying? If we look at the 4-year sector, I'll just share some facts here about what they are getting. Students are getting a 1 in 5 chance to graduate. They're getting a 95% likelihood that they will have to take out a loan. 57% chance of ending up with more than $30,000 in debt, and a 1 in 5 chance to default on their student loans within the first 3 years from when they start repayment. So again, very high cost and questionable value from the standpoint of the students.
Go ahead, yeah, Mike.
Okay, so as a student, I can tell you a good portion of the way that, because I went to both the schools that I went to were on grounds. A good portion of, what I went through was you would be, basically they would tell you to apply for FAFSA, which is the, you get, access to the Pell Grants and the federal loans through that. And, they tell you how much, that you qualified for. And then, from there, you would move on. Sorry. It was always very, very quick, very high pressure. But you never knew how much you truly racked up. It was kind of the moving goalpost of numbers. Basically they brought you, this is from an on-grounds experience, they brought you into the, the financial aid office, and, you would have the, they would tell you need to fill out the, when I went through, they still had Sallie Mae as the federal, I should say loan broker, and they would have the information already, the promissory notes already ready. They just would tell you, oh yeah, can you fill out this, this, and this, and then we're going to get you on a conference call with Sallie Mae, and then you can just you just say this, and they would have it pretty much loaded, for what you drew out, and usually it was, over the course of 2 terms for them, which were very short, and it just seemed very very off. But you didn't know how much you were racking up, because they have this magic thing they call deferment, which means you don't have to make any kind of payments while you were there, and basically while you're at school. So you don't know what that dollar sign is, what that dollar sign forming over your head is. It's just like this, it's out of your mind. They basically have you just your nose to the grind on projects or your studies, and you're not really to worry about that, because you have that, for me it was job placement was a big thing. So that job placement at the end of the line that I was waiting, that I was hoping for, was there to catch all that financial stuff. That was do my part, do all the work, and get all that done. and then, there was something waiting for me at the end of the tunnel. Little did I know that once that deferment, disappears, you start getting, your ex-girlfriend Sally Mae that doesn't like to let you, leave you alone, even if you don't have a job at the time.
Great, thanks. Great,
And
thanks.
this is a trend in nonprofits and for-profits. After a certain number, it becomes monopoly money. Where soon no one really understands how much $50,000 or $100,000 over 30 years is going to affect your life, how that affects your ability to buy a house or a car or to eat. And so we could do with better financial literacy across the board, not just in for-profits, to help students really understand what this means in terms of your options. What jobs can you take? What jobs would you like to take that you will not be able to take because you can't afford it based on these loans? And I think we see that across higher ed in general.
Right, yeah, go
May
ahead.
I also point out that, again, to go back to my hyperbole, if this really is consumer fraud, somebody may be liable to retort, but it doesn't make business sense to rip off poor people. That's the meaning of being poor, means you don't have money to be ripped off in the first place. And that's when the issue of public subsidies come in and the issue of vouchers come in, because it becomes viable only if there is funny money involved. So it's not just that you see a business model that typically spends, if you do the averages, maybe about 12 to 13% of annualized costs go into actual teaching, compared to better than 50% of annualized costs going into teaching. So think about it in manufacturing terms, right? A company that is charging a higher price for a product that seems to cost a lot less to manufacture somehow. And understand that the customers, again, are very specifically targeted to be marginalized segments of our population, the kinds of people who don't have a political voice, the kinds of folks that you can rip off and not really face any significant consequence. And then understand that while we're looking at capitalism at work, it's a very odd variation on capitalism, because it's capitalism that by the numbers seems to abjectly fail the market test. Why is it that when you look at the cash flows, better than 90% of the cash flows can be traced back to vouchers? Why is it even the most publicly dependent institution in this? People are stunned to hear this, SUNY, University of Colorado. I mean, some of our finest public institutions in this country, people are stunned to learn that some state universities receive a whopping 7% of their operating budget from the state.
I have the figures from
Right?
CU last year was 5.7% of their budget.
And that's a
came from
public
the state.
institution. So
It's-
even the most publicly dependent public institution in this country actually ends up to be a much more viable market player, because there's philanthropy and private money coming in. And here's a product that only one entity seems to buy, and that is the federal government, whose rules are rigged through lobbying, not because consumers are making informed choices.
I think if we think about the tuition levels in this and how this play off, we also know that there are private nonprofits with fairly high tuition, and people also think about some public sector institutions as having high tuition. It's not just the tuition level, though, that we need to understand. It's how students are paying for this, or what other sort of subsidies are going into this. In the nonprofit sector, a large proportion, somewhere maybe even as much as 50%, of the stated tuition is made up for through institutional grants or other sorts of compensation to the student that the student is not obligated to repay. In the state sector, a large proportion of what goes into paying for instruction, even though there is a lower subsidy from the state, is made up by state tax support. So additional money is not obligated to the student in order to pay that tuition. In the for-profit sector, on the other hand, the vast majority of the revenue that comes to tuition is borne exclusively by the student, or perhaps by their family, through taking out of loans. Those loans are part of the requirement, and so the obligation is on the student to pay for this. There's no societal or institution commitment to help pay for those things, and it's one of the differences when you compare the different tuition rates. What is the impact on the student, the individual student who's purchasing the education? I think is a pretty important element to consider.